said, I just want to mention that this webinar series for 2021 is sponsored by Sedgwick Brand Protection, which is formerly Stericycle. And you all know Stericycle, so we appreciate Sedgwick Brand Protection sponsoring this webinar series, and thank them very much for their support. So with that, Lawton, next slide. Let me just tell you who the speakers are today. I'm there in the middle. I'll be talking to you and John Barrera and Don Mays. You see their current jobs. And in the invite, there was a lengthier description. And all I can say is between the three of us, I think I didn't get the exact number, but I think we're at least almost 120 years of experience with product safety. Now, of course, most of that is Don Mays, who had 100 years, and it just kind of was new to the subject. No, we all have a lot of experience, and with a lot of different companies. And you know, my companies, when I was in-house lawyer, were a huge and multi-division and a bit different than I think some of the other experiences that John and Don have. So. But between the three of us, we've been around the block on establishing product safety programs, and I think we can be helpful to you in identifying what we think may work, may not work. But as you'll hear, kind of the overriding theme of all this, you'll hear, is that there is no one right product safety management program. It depends on your company, your tolerability for risk, the way you organize, where you're located, how many personnel you have, where are the product safety people located, you know, within the corporate structure, and all kinds of things. But we'll be talking about that. And I think probably the biggest takeaway from all of this is it's your job to figure out what makes sense for your company. We are going to give you, I think, the tools of things you need to think about in establishing a product safety management program, but ultimately you get to decide what you think makes sense for your company. So with that said, let me turn it over to Don. So next slide, and then Don's going to cover sort of an introduction about what overall issues you need to be thinking about and why this is so important. Don?
Thanks, Ken. You know, all the times I talk about product safety issues, talk about how they're positioned within a company and why they're so important for a company. And a lot of companies look at it as, well, you know, it's really, you have a product safety program just to avoid recalls. And then, you know, if you haven't complied with regulatory requirements, you might be concerned about government penalties, fines, consent decrees, even criminal charges against some of the executives of your companies. So there's sort of that fear. There's also the fear of reputational damage that you get from media exposure and some public embarrassment. You know, companies are always afraid of that negativity because it can involve lost sales and loss of trust in your brand. But the other things that are of concern is, you know, product liability lawsuits that come out of safety issues and including insurance claims. And there's also your CFO is going to be concerned about increased operational costs. You know, what it's going to cost to have a recall, what it's going to cost to have a criminal penalty. And so there's that cost to the bottom line that a lot of the financial people in your organization are going to have great concern about. But I think most of us who are in the product safety field and are professionals in that field worry about social responsibility, the responsibility that we have to one another, the responsibility that we have to our company to make sure that our companies are not putting out of the market products that could potentially injure somebody. So that's really what drives me in my profession, and I'm sure it's the same for Ken and John, that social responsibility is sort of the overriding reason why we are in this profession. Back to you, Ken.
No, you got 2 more slides to deal with.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so keep going.
Oh, so yeah, there is a strong interrelationship between product safety, product liability, and regulatory and standards compliance. One of the things I think that is an important point to remember that coming out of this session today is that product safety is not the same as product compliance. This is all three parts of this three-legged stool that you see in front of you have to work together. There are those concerns about the product liability, of course. There's concerns about meeting the regulatory and compliance standards, which is really the minimum threshold or the license to bring your product to the market. But that is not the same as product safety, which goes beyond that. Goes beyond the fear of product liability lawsuits. It goes beyond compliance issues and involves sciences that are perhaps a little bit softer than what you see for just simply meeting a regulatory compliance requirement. It might involve even things like human factors analysis to understand what some of the potential safety issues are with your product. And in addition, being able to leverage data to understand that, using things like big data analytics to be able to understand where some of those pitfalls lie when you bring a product to the marketplace. Next slide. So here's a pretty clear example of why compliance does not equal safety. We did some research looking at CPSC recalls over the recent 5-year period. And our finding was that only 14% of the products named in CPSC recalls were in violation of some kind of compliance requirement, some kind of rule or standard. So there's some failure to comply with that. In the other cases, 86% of those cases, there was some other safety hazard that was identified once that product was in the marketplace. So it had passed all standards, most likely, to begin with, so you could enter that product in the marketplace, but then it was uncovered that there's another safety issue. Today's news, if you haven't seen it already, is a pretty clear example of that. Peloton finally announced a very large recall, on a very public recall, on their treadmills. I'm most certain that treadmill was in compliance with the UL standards that apply to treadmills, their motors and their electronic controls. And I'm most certain that the treadmill was also compliant with the ASTM requirements. There are several ASTM standards that actually cover treadmills. But once that product was in use, some other safety hazard developed. It resulted in multiple injuries. In the recall report today from the CPSC, they said that there are 72 injuries associated with those treadmills, and almost 36 injuries were to children because children were getting essentially pulled underneath the deck of those treadmills. Now, it's probably something that originally wasn't anticipated when that product was brought to the market. It may have been that the company, and I don't know this for certain because I don't work with the company, but it may be that the company determined that the compliance with the existing regulatory requirements and voluntary standards was simply enough to ensure the safety of that product. But clearly, once the product was in the marketplace, in consumers' homes, another safety issue was uncovered, which was very important. And I'm certainly glad that the company has actually dealt with that by announcing a recall today.
Yeah, and can I just say one thing, that one of the webinars that I think we'll do near the end of the year, after the summer, is on standards and how to use standards, how they can be misused against you. And the very important question, to go to exactly what Don said, and that is, when do you need to exceed the standards, safety standards that apply to your product? That is a big conundrum, particularly for engineers. Try to figure that one out. So on the theory that standards compliance or even regulatory compliance may not result in a product as safe as you'd like it, then the question is, okay, so how do you figure out when to exceed those standards? So I think that's a good topic for later on, since particularly within the consumer product area, there are lots of standards around that you need to be aware of. Most of them are voluntary, some of them are mandatory through the CPSC, but not that many. So that's a big question to be answered. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. I think you're done with that slide, Don. Mm-hmm. Okay, now the next 4 slides, I'm going to go through them very quickly. a number of years ago, I did a benchmarking study on all the literature concerning product safety management in the organizational area. And I did it for a particular company that was trying to figure out, should they hire a full-time product safety director? Where should that person be located? Should it be at corporate? Should it be within the divisions? How should they organize their product safety function? And so not only did I do a benchmarking study, but I flew around the country and interviewed about 10 companies that had good product safety programs. So within this, within these slides, I've got a real quick summary of what some of the more interesting pieces of literature I found on product safety management. Now, after the webinar, we'll be posting with the slides the results of the benchmarking study. So you'll see a lengthy summary of these and other publications that talk about product safety management. So let me just show you a couple of these, but you're going to have a lot more information on this. So here, this one is from the conference board. It was a 1979 survey that was done. And then this was their conclusion about what you should do. That was a long time ago, but I really don't think corporate organization has changed a whole lot over the years. So go to the next slide. The Rand Institute for Civil Justice, they interviewed 9 companies. And then they analyzed the interviews, analyzed the data out there, and then came to a few conclusions. And these were the conclusions they had. A separate product safety group is essential, as opposed to having product safety, having basically everyone's job be product safety, which is sometimes what we said. And they also believe that a corporate level product safety department plays a critical role. And we're going to talk about where you put product safety. Is it the corporate level? Is it a divisional level, a product line, a business unit? Where should that go exactly, and how do you figure that one out? The other things in here seem pretty obvious. Next slide. A management consulting firm, Patiglio, Robin, Todd, and McGrath, did a study also. And they had a couple of interesting comments in here. I think the third bullet is pretty easy, but the first two are interesting. One, and I think we all understand this maybe, but these guys did a study, and it was their conclusion too. And that is, most of the safety problems that come up, and I don't know if any marketing people are on the phone, or on the webinar, but basically it's caused by the company trying to get a product into the marketplace before it's ready to go. And for competitive reasons, going back to the Ford Bronco fiasco of 30 years ago, that was the big problem. This Ford rushed the Bronco to market to meet the Chevy Blazer, whatever their competitor was, who had gotten to market. And they just cut corners on safety, and that created some problems. And that's all public information that came about in the product liability cases. So speed to market compromises safety. And we're going to talk later in the Q&A about how do we make safety as important as marketing, or maybe more important as marketing, and what do safety people do to try to put the brakes on a product that really isn't ready to be sold. And so that was, I think, an interesting result of this study. And secondly, and maybe more importantly also, in that there's no standard industry approach to safety management. And that's certainly what I think we all find is, hey, you got to figure this out for your company. And there's so many different ways companies are organized. The first product safety committee I sat on, with one division of a huge company, we had 1,200 lawsuits all by ourselves. Our product safety efforts were directed to, why the heck do we have so many lawsuits, and what can we do about cutting them back? So we were dealing mostly with post-sale issues, not pre-sale issues, and we'll talk about that. So very different from company to company. So no standard industry approach. Next slide. Now, the CPSC has had a lot to say about product safety management within companies. One, there's the Handbook for Manufacturing Safer Consumer Products. That talks about it a little bit, and that's in the benchmarking study. The Recall Handbook talks a little bit about it. But where it came up a lot was in civil penalty settlement agreements. The CPSC started requiring that companies agree in their settlement agreements to establish product safety management programs or to enhance the ones they have. So now that only affects the companies that have agreed to this in their settlement agreements, but it gives you an idea about what companies are agreeing to and what the CPSC thinks is adequate. Now, because there was some confusion over it, the general counsel of the CPSC, who was in 2014, wrote an article describing what she thought was a good compliance, she called it compliance programs. So just two comments in there. On the left side, at the end, effective compliance programs are tailored to a company's business and the associated risks. That's important. That confirms what we're talking about. You know, you really got to make it match what your company, and if you can see on the right side at the end, risk profile, operations, internal controls, governance structure of the company. And so the CPSC has substantial flexibility. So if you are in a civil penalty situation and have a settlement agreement, you want to be sure you're willing to do what the CPSC is proposing. But CPSC in their mind and in these other documents has a lot of flexibility and understands that every company is a bit different. So with that said, next slide. Here are the 5 topics we're going to talk about. Policies, product safety managers, who's in charge, the personnel within the group, what do you do about product safety committees, and then training. So first question I wanted to ask John and Don is, and next slide, sorry. We have this debate within compliance and the ethics community, business ethics community, is how do we get people's attention? Do we tell them that if you do these things, this is going to be a lot better company? So in the safety context, we're going to have safer products, satisfied customers, less expense, improved reputation. So do we accentuate the positive side of why you do these things, or do we accentuate the negative side, or maybe a combination? Gee, if we don't have a safe product, we're going to have accidents and lawsuits, and expense, regulatory problems, recalls, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the best way to get people's attention? And this partly deals with the question of how do you develop a safety culture? So now I sort of answered it right here. There is no consensus really on it. It really depends on, if you've got 1,200 lawsuits, then we're trying to prevent lawsuits. If you've never had a lawsuit before and you're just starting out, then we're trying to build sales. So, and our reputation. So it's very dependent on the company, but I wanted to ask Don and John, let's see, I'll start with Don about your thoughts on how do you encourage safety and encourage the development of a safety culture.
Well, I hate to answer a question with a question, but I guess one of the questions is, does safety sell? Or is safety just an expectation of consumers who buy that product? If you say, well, we've got the safest product out there, that used to work a long time ago for Volvo. I don't know that it still does, but that was their whole advertising campaign, that they had a safer vehicle. Whether or not tests proved that or not, I'm not sure. But the fact is that they for many, many years, they advertised that, and people did buy Volvos because of that. I haven't seen those kind of campaigns recently for any other product manufacturer.
That's because the lawyers have told them to not do it.
That's probably right. But I do think that safety, product safety, is the expectation of all consumers who buy products. So how do you turn, let's say, the risk of lawsuits and civil penalties and recalls from the negative standpoint to a more positive standpoint? Part of it is in fact what Ken mentioned before about developing a safety culture within a company, that it starts from the top, that the top of your organization is insisting that you do have a safety program that is effective, that is supported within the company, and that the safety organization within your company has the authority to take action when action is required. John may have some other ideas, and John, what do you think?
I'm thinking of when I think both are absolutely necessary. And I think both are needed depending on the audience who you're trying to encourage. If it's going to be upper management, or you're trying to encourage, say, a marketing team of extra safety things you may need to do, or even the operation in terms of vendors and the inspectors. So I think both are needed, and it's going to depend on the audience. I think if you're trying to, like for an example, if you're trying to let your customers know you have a safety program, you want to talk about the positives. It's like, hey, it's going to be better for you. You can talk about how safe the products are, the different things you do to encourage that. If you're talking to your legal department or your finance department, you may want to encourage some of the negatives to say, hey, you can avoid some of these things by having the product safety team. And I think when you do either of those, you should go in with examples of what those negatives are. For example, specific lawsuits, specific litigation, specific recalls and claims, and also some of the positives, some of the money that you may have saved by implementing this, some of the recalls you may have prevented by implementing redundancy or something else within a design. So I do think both are very important. You need to know what the audience is looking for and then emphasize those points, but include both positive and negatives.
Yeah, and let me just say, as a lawyer, we unfortunately usually emphasize the negative part. And we have to be very careful that we don't just scare the heck out of everybody and they basically don't want to work within safety anymore. Because when we start to talk about, you're going to have to justify all your actions if we get sued and you get deposed in a lawsuit, for example, and you're going to have to testify about why you approve this particular design. That gets people's attention, and engineers generally are always concerned about getting sued personally in a product liability case. So we got to be careful about it, but it's really important because, and I'll weave this throughout if I can, if there's time, is that we always have to keep in mind the possibility we're going to get sued. And how do we explain to a jury, to the government, to a judge, that we're a safe company and we try to make safe products? So we're always trying to think defensively as we do everything. But that is a little scary to a lot of people, but it's kind of hard to avoid. But it does get their attention, I will say that. Okay, next slide. So let's start with the first topic, product safety policies, and I'll have John continue on. And now we're not going to talk about everything that's in each of these slides. This is meant partly to, here are the things you need to think about, but we don't have time to go through each of these, in any detail at all. But so we'll, between the three of us, we'll give you short comments on each of these 5 topics. And there'll be more information we'll be posting that give you more guidance on some of these things. So go ahead, John.
I think when it comes to policy, for me, the first thing to do is really define, well, what is a policy? Because I think a policy, again, to me, would be something that you don't give on. A policy is not necessarily a guideline. A policy may not even necessarily be a requirement that can be changed or modified depending on product, the timing, cost, and other things. A policy is something that's a mandate, something you won't go back on. And so I think it's a very high level thing to develop the policy and to make sure that the buy-in is there from the executive teams and from your product safety staffs, that they understand these are things we don't give on, that we mandate. So for example, a policy may be, we will never ship a product until we have the certificate of compliance or declaration of conformity, GCC, call it what you will. We will never ship a product unless we have that in place. That's a policy. If you tend to go around that policy and decide to ship, well, then it's not really a policy. It may be a requirement that you deviate on. The policy is a mandate. And I think that's the first thing for me, is to define what that policy really is and things you won't give on. And when it comes to safety, you have to be careful because some are just requirements that are best practice, but in terms of cost, feasibility, timing, may not necessarily be something you have to do because you have other means around it. But policy is, to me, is at that high level, comes from top down, and everybody lives by that policy.
Okay, Don? Oh, sorry.
One thing, just one other point to emphasize what John said is the fact that when you do have right policies, they have to be living, breathing documents. They have to be updated, reviewed on a regular basis, just the way, ASTM standards, for example, are reviewed on a regular basis. They need to be reviewed. You need to make sure that that there is some sort of level of sign off and dating and version control on those policies. I've seen things that, relegated to the file cabinet and, at least in the old days, relegated to the file cabinet and nobody brushes the dust off them for any number of years until a crisis develops. So that is important. Make sure you keep them updated. You can go to the next slide.
The last
No,
thing
wait.
I was saying that Don made me think of something there too, is that when you do document your policies, understand it's documented. Don't document something you're not going to follow or is not truly a policy, because that certainly will come back and haunt you.
It's an excellent point.
Sure, if it's a documented policy, that's what you want to have, and it's agreed upon by everybody involved with that decision.
Yeah, let me just throw in a legal comment, which is similar to John, and that is, I think absolutely you should have a policy. If you have policies for everything else, you should definitely have a product safety policy. And you don't want to overpromise. So you never would want to have a policy that you'll never sell a product that can hurt people. That's ridiculous and that's impossible. So we're only required to come up with products that are reasonably safe, and how you describe what your goals are is good, but you got to make it clear that that's your goal, that's what you're trying to do. You're going to guaranteeing that the products can't hurt people. And so you want to be real careful. I think they should be from corporate. I'm not sure if I'd have the CEO sign it. If you don't want to drag the CEO into a lot of these things to get involved in lawsuits, for example. So it might be executive vice president or the vice president of engineering, or however the safety organization reports up to. Now, and whether it depends on your corporate structures, whether it's just at corporate or you then have a division or business unit or product line that has their own policy. But it's nice to show to a jury, if you have to, that, hey, yeah, that's our goal. Our goal is to do these things, but you want to make sure you don't overpromise. And then it makes it look like you're just creating this paper just to look good, but you're really not intending to meet it. So I wouldn't have detailed policies. That's where your procedures, the procedures that you create to implement the product safety program, that's where that goes. So I wouldn't have a really long, detailed corporate product safety policy, but have more detailed procedures to implement. Okay, Don, go ahead. Next slide.
Well,
we already are on. Sorry, move back. Sorry.
Back, yeah. And Ken, just to add on to this, and because we do appreciate Sedgwick being a sponsor, that one of the things is a lot of companies don't have a recall process or procedure in place or a policy in place, and what should be, how to actually implement a recall. And I think that sometimes is important to have some sort of a playbook in place in the event that, the unfortunate event that you have to execute a recall. At least you know exactly how to execute it. There's at least a high level procedure for being able to follow a recall playbook. You might not have specific names to it. You might not have specific customers related to it, but there is an overarching playbook that will help company implement a recall more effectively, as opposed to trying to scrap something together at the very last minute. On the question about product safety personnel, and this is something, when I talk at St. Louis University, I get an awful lot of questions and actually challenges about where product safety should fall within a company and who should be staffing that product safety team. Should it be full-time or part-time, for example? That all really depends upon the structure of your company. Ken alluded to this before. So some companies have got very complex structures. So it might be at the corporate level, it might be at the divisional level. It depends upon how that company is structured. The question about who the head of the product safety team reports to, it is my feeling, and I think that my colleagues would share this feeling, that it really has to report up to that top of the organization. If it's relegated to the lower level of the organization, that product safety team is not going to have much authority. And perhaps it's an indication that there isn't a very strong culture of safety within the company. But if product safety is supported from the top of the organization, if in fact you've got a direct line into the CEO or to the C-suite, we think that that's very important to establish that the sort of culture of safety within the company. The personnel in this team, my belief is that you always have the strongest teams when you have people from diverse backgrounds. They could be lawyers, they could be engineers, they could be scientists, they could be even people in your public relations department that would have a clear understanding for how product safety can impact the entire enterprise. So diversity, I think, is really important. The question is, should it include compliance? Yeah, compliance team should be at the table, but as I mentioned before, shouldn't be the sole avenue for product safety to be reporting to. A lot of people feel that product safety should report into a compliance department. I don't believe so, based on the slide that I showed earlier, when only 14% of the recalls announced by the CPSC over the past 5 years were related to compliance issues. Safety goes beyond that, and so therefore I think the compliance needs to be at the table, but not necessarily should not be part of the direct reporting responsibility. Again, reporting to the top of the company is having at least that direct line of communication to the top of the company, I think is critically important to be able to establish an effective culture of safety within a company. Any other comments on that?
John?
Well, I hate to repeat everything that you guys have said, but I just want to emphasize my view too, is the safety personnel, if it's one person, a team, various teams, has to have a line up to executive management and the C-suite, and reporting what is going on so they have a full understanding of it and they can help you make those decisions if they need to. But it's got to go up top. You cannot make that in a silo. So that's ultimately, I think, key for the product safety personnel, one person, 5, however many it may be, to have that line of command. The second thing is, it goes way back to the first slides too, and Don and Ken both said, it just depends on the company. How involved are you with the products that you make? Do you just let vendors design, develop, and make them? Or do you have a design and development team in-house that you have to support that looks for your team's guidance on a real-time basis instead of waiting overnight or the midnight calls or something like that? So you really need to know what your products need in terms of safety personnel. And what that product assortment is, because you can have very complex products that you're making, or you can make very simple products as well. And that's also where the diversity of the expertise within your staff comes into play. Do you need some electrical engineers on the staff, some mechanical, manufacturing, materials, all types of people that can help you get to where you are. But the more variety you have, I think that also helps bring in the different views as you're looking at safety issues. So it does depend on the organization, complexity, how involved are you with the products, how involved do you want to be, and ultimately, are you indemnified on anything, and what's your liability on that as well?
Okay, yeah, and I think most companies are going to have a combination of product safety personnel and corporate, depending on the size of your company, and they're going to do more general things. They're going to establish policies and procedures that the divisions can use, help them set up their programs. But I don't think, in most big companies at least, that the corporate product safety personnel are going to be involved in risk management, risk assessment of specific products. Certainly they should get involved in any recalls or reports to the government, because that's more of a corporate thing. But you don't want people at corporate helping design products within the divisions. So at Emerson Electric, where I was years ago, we had 140 divisions. Our corporate product safety guy, I think he mostly did just CPSC work, and that was it. He wasn't out there helping design products, but I've done work with other companies where the corporate product safety people would sit on every risk assessment for every product development team. So it's just very different. Whatever you want to do, it's just how much resources you want to devote to it and how many people you would do that. At Westinghouse, our corporate product safety function audited the division's product safety functions. That was their main role. They didn't get involved in day-to-day decisions on safety issues. Now they had safety people in the division. So again, but these are the kinds of things you need to decide. And that's why we're giving you, complete flexibility to do what you want, what makes sense. Yeah, but how do you convince your CEO that you have an effective program, and how might you have to convince the government or a jury later on that you had an effective program at managing the safety of the products? Okay, I think next slide. So the next issue is a product safety committee, and similar issues involving the personnel, but it's a little bit different because it's a much broader group, and it's very dependent on the organization of the company. But let me start with John on this one.
I'm going to start kind of with that bottom bullet on the international side, and also kind of what Don had mentioned on the diversity of whether it's your department or this committee. I think as you talk about international, there's very different views on product safety and product safety more so than compliance, really, and what safety issues are, what the responsibility of consumers are or are not. And I think that's important to have the diversity on that committee to bring in those different views, because they could be very different than from country to country and culture to culture. That's been my experience with it. You can have even if before you have this product safety committee that may be high above, you may have some sub product safety committees within your department. And there's been many times even within those sub meetings, I don't want to call it committee, but there's so much disagreement even within your own staff. And to come to a consensus to bring it to this committee so they will have those same kinds of discussions and disagreements. And I think the other thing with the committee is really deciding, what are they supposed to do? Are they only looking at problems that have occurred? Are we looking to prevent problems? Are we looking at trends that happen throughout the industry so we can tackle? So I think it's important to focus on what are they supposed to do? And do they meet like every month to talk about it? Or do they only meet when there's an issue raised from those sub guys below that are finding these things?
Hey, Don?
So, and I think it's a combination of all of that, John. And it's the product safety committee that I run at Samsung is involved with not only looking at any kind of issues that develop over the course of time, but also looking at proactive measures to prevent those issues from happening in the future. But they're also involved in setting, policies going forward, so that it's sort of the high level. And if you can go to the next slide, I'll show you. This is the product safety committee that I set up at Samsung when I joined. I chair that committee, and I've got a sub chair from our product safety department that chairs actually weekly meetings. They're standing meetings attended by a dozen or so people. The legal team is represented by people who handle product liability issues. The compliance team is also at that table. There's a government relations team personnel that attend. Our PR team that handles risk management, public relations risk management, sits at the table. Of course, our customer service team has got a very strong seat at the table, actually several people from our customer service team, because that's where the information about any kind of issue that may have developed comes in through that channel, through customer service. Quality assurance is at the table, engineering, R&D, the laboratory management, the people that manage our quality assurance laboratories. And although this doesn't exist at Samsung, when I was running a consulting practice for Deloitte in the past, I actually served as an outside expert consultant on another company's product safety committee. And it gives that committee sort of that independent view of how other companies work, and brings to the table a certain level of expertise and perspective that might not exist if you're just talking among yourselves within the company itself. But what's the objectives? Well, you meet regularly. As to how often you meet, it really depends upon the complexity of your business. We meet weekly just because Samsung is a very complex company with a lot of complex products. You might assess and you score risk, you prioritize the issues, you determine what issues to escalate to the highest ranks, meaning you're going to bring it up to the C-suite, to the CEO, if in fact it's a critical issue. You might even be developing some kind of recommendation for corrective actions. That doesn't mean a technical recommendation, but it means, is there something you can do? What are the next steps that you should be taking? Should we be going back to R&D suggesting that they make an adjustment to the product, for example? Again, I mentioned developing policies, which I think is a critical function. The other thing that we do, and not all product safety committees do this, but we actually develop training programs, and we provide regular training for the stakeholders within our teams so that they understand not only the issues of the day, but also how to develop proactive measures for preventing any injuries or issues from happening in the future. So training is part of our mission. We also maintain records. And we also monitor employee reporting. So if, every company should have a sort of this whistleblower independent reporting function so that people can report, let's say, non-compliance issues or safety issues into a protected site. And so we actually monitor that site also. Anything else you want to add, gentlemen, to this?
I just want to add one quick thing really quick, and that was just on the thing about prioritizing issues. And to me, the Product Safety Committee really is one of their tasks is to stay ahead of these issues and to stay ahead of, say, media issues as well. And I think by doing this and having these folks in there, it gives them that ability to stay ahead. Right? And don't just tackle reactive stuff. The job is to stay, the goal is to stay ahead of things. Right?
Yeah, let me throw in my legal input here. Again, we'll do a webinar, I think, later on documentation of product safety efforts. How do you document what you've done? And this is a perfect example. You can see the things that this committee would do and the people who are involved could create some very touchy documents and potentially dangerous documents. Certainly doing risk assessment in and of itself could be dangerous depending on how you write it. So, but this committee could create some things, particularly when you deal with post-sale issues like recalls and incidents and things like that. So I just want to point out the fact that there are lawyers on this committee does not make the notes that are taken, the minutes of these meetings, attorney-client privilege. There's very particular rules on that. So you need to have some rules set up and input by the lawyers as to, what do you write down? You hopefully can talk about anything. Although you could always be deposed in the future, but how do you deal with this? Because this by definition is potentially harmful information, particularly when you're dealing again on the post-sale side. So you got to keep that in mind. This is just one of these things that you don't like to think about, but it is important. And because you're creating the history of this product, of this company, and you want to show that you thought about safety, you care about safety, you did your best job in trying to predict future risk. You tried to make rational decisions based on the data and based on your best judgment. And that's about the best you can do. Now, if accidents happen and you get sued and you have to justify what you did, you want to be able to portray that you cared about safety. They can still criticize what you did. So how this committee is run, what kind of minutes are taken, I just want to at least point out that don't think because lawyers are involved in it, that turns them into attorney-client privilege. And one other thing I would say in my experience in helping companies set up programs is if you have a wide breadth of products, and when I was at Westinghouse Electric, we made nuclear reactors and we owned Longines Watch Company. So having a corporate product safety committee didn't make any sense. There's no way, there was nothing consistent about any of the product lines we had. It was just all over the place. So is it at corporate? Is it in the divisions, the business units? Critical decision. And you might have different committees at different levels with different roles. Another company I did this for with similar broad range of products, we recommended divisional or business unit product safety committees who actually did this kind of stuff that Don's got up here on the slide, but to have a corporate product safety council made up of the head product safety people in the divisions who would meet periodically to share best practices corporate-wide. So they were talking more generally about what works, what doesn't work in the product safety function. So it was a corporate product safety committee, but they dealt in a much more general way. They would never, I don't want somebody in the nuclear products division dealing with a problem with a watch. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So it really very dependent on it, but you can have different committees at different levels. But the important thing is that people are talking to each other. There's input from various functions, and that people who know something about product safety, have the opportunity to provide input. Okay, next slide. And the last of our 5 topics, product safety training. And I'll start with Don on this one. You talked about some seminars you were doing in-house, I think. So go ahead, start.
Yeah, we do seminars in-house, and we also talk about issues that you hear in the media, and there's plenty of them, because you can learn from, let's say, the mistakes of others, and you don't want to make those same mistakes. But there's also the external training. Training at St. Louis University is something that I encourage. There's attendance to ICPSO conferences, for example, are all places where you can network and get information about essentially honing your skills as a product safety professional. Who should attend? People that have got a strong interest and are stakeholders in this area. Any member of your product safety team should be in attendance. As far as who teaches, it all depends. Right now, we're running with our product safety committee every week. Different members train the other members. They bring something different to the table. And it's very helpful. Sometimes we even set up debates between the lawyers and the engineers, which is always a thrilling, makes for a very thrilling meeting. But it helps people to learn. The content, the exercises, sometimes we even do sort of tests, ask people to score their companies or score their business on various attributes of their product safety program to see how buttoned up it is, how robust it is. And we also train, we have regular training on the code of ethics, code of conduct. That is actually required by our company. And then as far as the supplier and dealer company, that is something that I do recommend that suppliers also be trained, although it's something that, quite frankly, in doing auditing when I was in the consulting business, very rarely do you see suppliers are actually trained. But yet the supply chain and the quality and the safety of the products coming out of your suppliers, particularly your first and second tier suppliers, is critical. Yet generally people don't actually bring their level of training to that nature. Any other comments, gentlemen?
I think training it's a huge, wide breadth subject, because like the last bullet says, well, who are you training? Are you training your staff? Are you training a department that's not involved in safety, but so there's an awareness there? Are you training your vendors? Even training service providers to perform certain inspections, say if it's not a mandatory regulation or there's no standard and you're going above and beyond and created your own, you may have to train service providers, inspectors, labs on how you want something specifically done and looked at and how you want those results reported. So I think training is all across the board throughout an organization and throughout the resources the organization use. And the other question is I hate to always answer all these questions, but I think that's what you have to ask yourself as you develop your program. Are you training on trends in history? Are you training on regulation? Are you training on different types of design concepts and different types of disciplines within? So there's all these different types you need to look at to determine, but I think training is critical to the staff that is managing it. And usually they're open to training, but the challenge that I've run into with training is because there's a lot available out there, but do you have a budget for the training? will the company and the executives allow a budget for training, and what's that going to be? Because it's not always free. Our webinar is free, of course, but training is not always free. It could be expensive, and it takes time away from the office. So those are things you need to think about in the training, but it's absolutely critical to keep your team up to speed in all the different areas and to keep those stakeholders you work with up to speed on what's happening with product safety as well.
Okay, I had a couple of thoughts on training. I've done hundreds of in-house seminars over 44 years. So I have a few thoughts on this. One is that it's really important for different departments to have the ability to interact with each other during the training. Most of the training, my goal is to make them aware of risks. Not that we have the answers to it, because they have to use the concepts we're talking about in their daily jobs. But if they know when what they're doing is risky and they not sure how to do it, then they know who to ask. They know who to contact, and that's usually the product safety personnel, product safety manager. They know that there's somebody that can help them answer the question. So we're not trying to make them experts on this. It's an awareness training program, in my view, that we're trying to do. So, but you give them enough information so they understand where the risks are and how we can minimize the risks and how the company would like them to do it. But specific questions that they may have in the future, they need to know where to go to get the answer. One last thing, one of the most effective seminars I ever did was I did a half-day program to the entire company. People would talk to each other during the program, didn't realize that the marketing department did this and the engineering department did that, or they didn't realize they were supposed to talk to each other about the marketing literature, things like that. But then the president told everybody, have lunch within your departments, and then we're going to meet with you individually in the afternoon. So we met with engineering, we met with marketing and sales, we met with customer service separately. And that we wanted each group to come up with 10 things they were going to do better or differently as a result of this seminar. So they would have lunch together and then meet with me and the president and ask questions, and then also tell us what they thought they could do differently as a result of the seminar. So it kind of forced them to do something. And that's one of the problems with training, is they can all sit there and nod their heads and listen, and then nothing happens, nothing changes. So how do you get somebody to do something differently or better, or tell you what they need to have created, new procedures that have to be created, or let's make sure the marketing department doesn't print marketing literature without getting approval from the engineering department, for example. I mean, things like that have to happen. So whatever training you do, you want to build into it some way to get some action afterwards, that you can determine that it's actually been effective and got people's attention. And they'll pay attention if they understand they got to do something afterwards. So you're not giving them a test necessarily, although you could, but that you want them to do something about it.
And I'll just add one more thing too, as a product safety manager and the training that your staff needs, it's important to really, put yourself in their shoes and understand the decisions that they're having to make. So an example would be that we may do product safety and compliance one day, but the next day you're given a new task of now you're responsible for all environmental compliance. It's like, well, that's a whole different story. Or now you're involved with sustainability of products. Could be different, not necessarily regulatory or safety, things that these guys have been working on, or these folks have been working on and trained for years. All of a sudden you throw a different aspect that is new in the industry or new that's coming out there. Well, we don't always know everything. So there's got to be you've got to understand that the staffs don't know everything. They may need training on new types of tasks or disciplines that you're giving them to follow through with.
Okay, next slide. Now, so we don't have a whole lot of time for questions, and we got a few during the registration process. So I want to start with those. So I apologize if we don't get to your questions. What we're going to do is we'll take any of the questions that come in either now or later, and we'll answer them, and we'll try to post them in a place that you can see the answers. So I want you to be sure to know that we'll try to answer the questions, but we may not do it in the next 3 minutes. But but there's a way to either submit additional questions if you haven't already submitted it, or that if you want to post, if you're willing to have your company post sample product safety management information, we'd like to gather samples of some of this stuff because I think that's very helpful. But within the SPSP website, where it says webinar series under education, I think it is, we'll have the slides, a link to this seminar so others at your company can watch it, or if you have nothing better to do, you can watch this again if you'd like. But anyway, and that there'll be some more product safety management material. I'm going to put in an article that I wrote. I'm going to put in the benchmarking study. I've got the letter from the CPSC General Counsel in there. So there'll be some information on the SPSP website that'll hopefully give you more information than we can do within an hour here. But I want to deal with one real quick question. Somebody asked, is there any product safety software for risk assessment and audits? And we are going to undertake a search for such software. I'm only aware of one piece of software. It's called Design Safe, and the website is designsafe.com. And the engineer whose site that is has developed over the years software to do risk assessment, basically. And it's pretty good. It's a little bit more directed to machinery than it would be to consumer products, but it's pretty good stuff on that website. So if you go to designsafe.com, you can see that. Now, I know there's other risk assessment software out there, and there may be some other software on how to set up a product safety program, how to audit the company, or whatever. So we're going to look for it, and we will post that information later. So, but we don't know of a whole lot out there. There's a whole lot on workplace safety. Unfortunately, that's a little bit different. That's completely different, but not on product safety. It's just a new area. So anybody wants to develop software, it's out there. So, but let me ask another question about the future of product safety and product safety professionals. John, let me start with you on that one. That's another question that was submitted earlier. Go ahead.
My view is that I think there's a greater and greater demand for product safety personnel. And whether that's with retailers because of some of the obligations that they're now putting forth or being demanded of, or whether you're an importer or a distributor, there's a lot more requirements and complexity, I think, to product safety than it used to be, especially with chemicals management and things like that. So I think that it's a big field and in many disciplines, whether it's electrical, chemical, mechanical, manufacturing, all of those areas, legal, again, service providers, technicians, all that stuff I think is big. One of the examples I give, it might be kind of old now, it was CPSIA, but when that came out in section 104, there was a mandate to create these new regulations from existing industry or voluntary standard. And to me, that would require more expertise in-house, making sure you comply and do things that you weren't previously mandated to do. So I think that it's a big field and getting wider and wider and more complex, at least from what I see from managing a staff of all the different things that continue to come in and change. I think it is a growing field in all those areas.
John, it's hard not to notice that the CPSC that we're dealing with now, and at least for the next 4 years, is likely to be far more aggressive than what we've seen, let's say, over the past 4 years. We've already seen 2 large civil penalties being issued this year. We've seen them put out an alert about the safety of Peloton treadmills. And we're also seeing that there's a lot of activity of repealing Section 6B of the Consumer Product Safety Act, all things in which indicates to me that the agency is going to be a little more aggressive. That means that companies are going to have to make sure that they're buttoned up, that they're in compliance, that they're doing the right things to make sure that they've got the right people in place and the right policies and practices in place to ensure that they're not bringing unsafe products to the marketplace.
Yes, but I think there's a bright future for product safety professionals. There's more regulations. When we generally look at this, we think product safety is a lot driven by product liability lawsuits in the U.S. and a lot more by regulations in the EU and elsewhere. So I think we're seeing more product liability in other countries. We're seeing more regulations within the US and North America. So whether it's, what the concept that Don mentioned earlier, compliance isn't safety, but compliance is a big part of safety. That doesn't mean we want to comply, but that doesn't fully answer what's a safe product. And you may have to do more, and when do you do that? That's what we'll deal with later on in a future webinar. So it's important for both facets to be considered, and that three-legged stool is exactly right. All of those three things need to be part of the safety process and thought about so that we can minimize risk on safety, and regulatory non-compliance, and also product liability. And that will best serve the companies going forward. Anyway, I think we'll stop, and I apologize for those questions we didn't get to. We'll try to develop answers to those and post them. And thank you all very much for attending. And if you have ideas on future webinars you'd like, let us know at that email address that's on this slide. And thank you again for attending. Appreciate it. Laden, do you want to say goodbye to everybody?
Yep, I was going to reinforce one more time. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much for joining us. The webinar recording will be on the website by the end of the day. And don't forget, we're going to send out an email, I think tomorrow, about our June 2nd webinar. So be sure to sign up for that one.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, Ken.